Imagine you're driving through a sudden, blinding whiteout blizzard. I mean, the kind where the snow is coming at the windshield perfectly horizontally.
Oh, yeah, where you can't even see the hood of your own car.
Exactly. The wind is howling so loudly you can't even hear yourself think. You're gripping the steering wheel of this tiny, incredibly fragile car, and your knuckles are just turning white.
And you're just praying you don't veer off the road into the dark.
Right. Keep that terrifying image in your head. That visceral feeling of being completely at the mercy of the elements. Because that is the baseline emotional reality for what we are digging into today.
It's a completely hostile environment where you have zero control.
Yeah, and you're reduced to just trying to survive the next 10 seconds. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are taking a massive stack of sources today. Theological commentaries, ancient historical data, archaeological records, and modern sermons.
It's a really diverse stack of materials.
It is. And it's all centered around one of the most famous stories in human history, Jesus and Peter walking on water on the Sea of Galilee. Now, it's a story that almost everyone thinks they know, right?
Yeah, it's often treated as this sanitized children's book story. The moral usually just boils down to, keep your eyes on the prize, have enough faith, and you'll stay above the water.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Because when you actually read the historical and archaeological sources, you realize this isn't just a simplistic fable about magical buoyancy.
No, not at all.
It's actually a profound, multi-layered look at ancient sea monsters, the psychology of human panic, a mind-blowing 1986 archaeological discovery, and a deep dive into what it really means to have a conditional tragic faith.
And to understand any of that, we really have to throw out the picture book version. We'll start with the terrifying physical reality of that lake, dive into how the ancient mind actually viewed the ocean, analyze the psychology of Peter and the other 11 disciples, and finally, look at what this means for your everyday life.
So let's go right back to that blizzard feeling. Because before we can even begin to understand the psychological shock of this event, we have to grasp the sheer physical terror of the environment these men were trapped in. I mean, these weren't tourists on a luxury cruise.
Definitely not.
Give us a sense of the geography here. Like, how does a lake just turn into a death trap?
Well, to understand the violence of these storms, we have to look at the unique topography of the Sea of Galilee, which was also historically known as Lake Gennesaret or the Sea of Tiberias.
Right.
It is the lowest freshwater lake on planet Earth. It sits roughly 700 feet below sea level.
Wow, 700 feet.
Yeah. It's nestled down in the Syrian-African Rift Valley, shaped somewhat like a harp, and it's about 13 miles long and 7.5 miles wide. So it is essentially this massive, deep bowl surrounded by really steep hills and mountains, particularly the Golan Heights to the east.
So it's basically a giant basin trapping the air.
Precisely. And that topography creates a terrifying weather mechanism. Think of the basin like a massive atmospheric vacuum cleaner.
Okay, a vacuum cleaner.
The air down at the surface of the lake, because it's 700 feet below sea level, gets very warm and humid. Meanwhile, up on Mount Hermon to the north, the air is freezing cold.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah, when that heavy, cold mountain air funnels down the Jordan Rift Valley and hits the rim of the basin, it doesn't just blow across the water. It gets violently sucked down into the bowl, colliding with all that trapped warm air.
So it's this extreme, sudden pressure shift.
Exactly. It creates ferocious, localized tempests that literally seem to materialize out of thin air. The winds rush off the cliffs and hit the water with such force that the sea instantly turns into a nightmare.
That's terrifying.
And we actually have modern data on this. In March of 1992, one of these sudden storms sent waves 10 feet high, crashing directly into downtown Tiberias.
You're kidding.
No, it caused massive damage to a modern concrete city.
10-foot waves crashing into concrete. Now, put yourself in the middle of that pitch black, churning washing machine in the first century, which forces us to look at what they were actually floating in.
Right, the boat.
Yeah, I was reading through the archaeological journals we gathered, but I want you to walk through the Jesus boat discovery because the preservation process alone is unbelievable.
It really is. What's fascinating here is how recently we acquired physical, tangible evidence of the exact type of vessel used on this lake during the first century.
It was the 80s, right?
Yeah, in 1986, Israel experienced a severe drought. The water level of the Sea of Galilee dropped drastically, and it exposed wide swaths of the muddy lake bed.
Okay.
Two brothers, Moshe and Yuval Lufon, they were local fishermen from a nearby kibbutz and amateur archaeologists. They were just walking the newly exposed beach. And they noticed some ancient iron nails and the faint outline of timber buried deep in the mud.
Just stumbling across a 2,000-year-old shipwreck, just walking on the beach.
Right. But pulling it out of the mud wasn't just a matter of, digging it up with shovels.
Because the ancient wood was incredibly fragile.
Beyond fragile. If
Yeah.
they had just pulled it out, the artifact would have disintegrated in a matter of days.
Just crumbled.
Yeah, because when ancient wood is submerged for 2 millennia, the cellulose inside the wood cells completely degrades. The only thing keeping the cellular structure intact is the actual water trapped inside.
So if it dries out,
If you expose that wood to the air, the water evaporates, the cell walls collapse, and the timber literally turns to dust.
so how on earth did they save it? The sources mentioned this massive, frantic operation just to move the thing.
It took 12 days and nights of continuous work because the water levels were starting to rise again.
Oh, the pressure?
Exactly. To move it, they had to excavate the mud around it while constantly spraying it with water.
Mm.
Then they wrapped the entire hull in a protective mantle of fiberglass,
Oh.
and they injected insulating polyurethane foam all around it. They essentially created this giant, buoyant foam cocoon, which allowed them to physically float the ancient boat down the lake to a conservation facility.
That is wild. Floating a 2,000-year-old boat inside a modern foam cocoon? But that was just the transportation. The actual preservation process took, what, over a decade?
Yeah, it sat submerged in a heated wax bath for 12 years.
12 years.
They used a synthetic, water-soluble wax. Over that entire decade, the wax slowly permeated the timber, gradually displacing the water inside the degraded wood cells.
So the wax becomes the new structure.
Exactly. Once the wax cooled and hardened, it provided an artificial skeleton for the wood, finally allowing the boat to be exposed to the air without turning to dust.
That level of dedication is astounding.
Yeah.
And what that 12-year process revealed completely changes how we visualize the story.
It really does. Carbon dating and the specific mortise and tenon construction techniques place it squarely between 50 BC and 50 AD, right during the life of Christ.
And its dimensions tell a terrifying story when you place it in the context of those storms you mentioned.
Yeah, it's about 27 feet long and 7.5 feet wide. Crucially, it is flat bottom.
Which is bad for storms.
Very bad. A flat bottom is incredibly practical for fishermen who need to pull right up to the shallow shoreline to load nets. But in a violent storm with 10-foot swells, a flat bottom is a death sentence.
Because there's no keel.
Right. There is no deep keel to cut through the water and provide stability. A flat-bottomed boat just rolls and slams against the surface, making it incredibly prone to capsizing.
And it was rowed by 4 guys, right?
Yes. Rowable by 4 staggered rowers, meaning 4 guys pulling with everything they had.
The detail that really caught my eye in the analysis was the wood itself. It wasn't built from pristine, top-of-the-line cedar. The archaeologists found it was patched together with 10 different types of scrap wood.
Oak, willow, hawthorn, just whatever they could find.
Just scrap wood.
It paints a picture of intense economic hardship. Wood was scarce, and these fishermen were not wealthy. They repaired this boat over and over again, nailing random scraps of timber to the hull until it was finally beyond repair and sank.
So let's put all this physical reality together and set the scene. It is what the ancients called the 4th watch of the night. So sometime between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m.
The absolute darkest, coldest, most exhausting part of the night.
The disciples have been rowing for hours. They are sleep-deprived. Their muscles are burning with lactic acid, and they are making zero headway against a violent contrary wind funneling down that rift valley.
They're in a flat-bottomed boat, patched together with random scraps of wood, slamming into waves, taking on water.
Knowing that at any second they could be flipped into the freezing blackness. They're in a state of absolute physical terror.
Survival mode.
And when you're pushed to that kind of physical extremity, your mind starts to fracture. The sources note that right in the middle of this chaos, they see a human figure walking toward them on the water. And their immediate visceral reaction is to scream that it's a ghost.
Yeah, they panic.
Now, I really struggled with this reading through the material. These guys were blue-collar fishermen. They practically lived on this lake, catching local mushed fish.
St. Peter's fish, yeah.
Right. They knew the currents, the depths, the weather. Why would a bad storm make seasoned sailors abandon all logic and jump straight to ghosts and the supernatural?
Well, to understand their panic, we have to step completely out of our modern scientific mindset and inhabit the ancient biblical worldview.
Okay.
When you and I look at the ocean, we see H2O, tidal patterns, marine biology. But in the ancient Near Eastern mind, the sea was not just a body of water.
It meant something else entirely.
It was the physical embodiment of chaos, death, and utter cosmic disorder. It was the great untamed abyss.
Like staring into the void. I mean, think about that primal dread you get when you swim in the deep ocean and you can't see the bottom and you feel the temperature drop.
Exactly.
Take that natural human fear and multiply it by a culture that believed the deep was literally inhabited by dark forces.
In ancient literature, the chaotic sea was frequently personified as a terrifying monster like Leviathan or Rahab. The mythological concept of chaos camp, which is the struggle against the forces of chaos, was prevalent across the ancient world.
So being on the water was intrinsically scary.
To be at sea, especially in the grip of a tempest, was to be entirely at the mercy of malevolent, destructive powers. There was even a common superstition that evil spirits and demons actually lurked within the violent storms, seeking to drag the living down into the underworld.
So they aren't just fighting wind and water. In their minds, they are locked in a battle with the literal forces of death.
Yes. So when they are at their breaking point, staring into the chaotic abyss, and they see a human figure calmly treading on top of this violent, churning monster in the dead of night, they don't think it's a magic trick.
Right.
They assume it's an apparition, a demonic manifestation of the very evil that is trying to drown them.
Man, that makes their terror so much more understandable. They think the abyss has finally come for them. But the sources highlight how Jesus responds to this terror, and it's heavily rooted in Old Testament theology.
It is. If we connect this to the bigger picture of the Hebrew Scriptures books, like Job, the Psalms, or Isaiah, there is only one entity who has the power to defeat the chaotic sea.
God himself.
It is exclusively Yahweh, the Creator God, who treads on the waves of the sea and tramples the chaos monster to impose order on the cosmos. By walking on the water, Jesus is actively demonstrating divine authority.
And he verbally confirms it. He calls out over the howling wind, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." But the theological commentaries point out that the Greek phrase he uses for "it is I" carries massive weight.
Huge weight. The Greek phrase recorded there is ego eimi,
which literally translates to "I am."
Yes, it is the exact sacred name that God uses to reveal himself to Moses at the burning bush in the book of Exodus. When Moses asks for God's name, the response is, I am, W-H-O-I-M.
Wow. So Jesus is standing out there in the 700-foot deep basin, treading on the ultimate symbol of ancient chaos, essentially shouting into the hurricane, "The Creator is here."
It's a staggering theological assertion wrapped in a terrifying physical reality. He is asserting absolute mastery over the very elements that threaten to destroy them.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this is the exact moment where human psychology takes center stage, and Peter makes his famous, highly criticized move.
Oh, poor Peter.
Right. Jesus reveals his divinity, and Peter yells out over the storm, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Jesus says, "Come." Peter actually climbs over the edge of the scrap wood boat, walks a bit, sees the wind, gets terrified, and starts to sink.
Yeah, it's a very dramatic moment.
Now, Peter is universally used as a cautionary tale. He's the poster child for taking your eyes off the prize. But didn't he at least have the courage to get out of the boat? What about the other 11 guys who were just cowering in the back?
It's a brilliant contrast, and one of the most insightful commentaries we reviewed makes a profound distinction between the psychology of Peter and the psychology of the 11 in the boat. The author introduces this concept of a tragic faith.
Tragic faith. Like a crisis-only faith. Treating God like a cosmic vending machine or like a rabbit's foot.
Exactly. Tragic faith is a highly conditional, reactive kind of belief that only manifests when tragedy strikes. It's the desperate bartering we do when we have zero control left. Once the danger passes, the faith goes right back in the drawer.
And one of the sources shared an incredible anecdote that illustrates this perfectly. It was about a pastor in the 1970s.
Oh, the story about the tiny airplane.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he was flying with his basketball team from a remote First Nations village on the coast north of Prince Rupert. They were in this tiny 12-seat plane flying through terrible weather, and they hit gale force winds.
Sounds awful.
The plane starts violently dipping and swaying, and suddenly it just drops 20 feet entirely out of the sky.
Just free fall.
And the pastor immediately starts bartering with God. He prays, "Get me safely on the ground and I'll never sin again."
We've all done some version of that, making wild promises in the back of an ambulance or waiting for a biopsy result. And of course, once the plane lands, that promise vanishes.
Right. The author of the commentary argues that the 11 disciples who stayed glued to the floorboards of the boat were exhibiting this exact kind of tragic faith.
They were just waiting for it to be over.
They were paralyzed by fear, only crying out in sheer terror, essentially waiting for the storm to be completely over and the all clear to be sounded before they were willing to worship him. They wanted the comfort of safety before they exercised faith.
Which completely reframes Peter's action. Stepping over the gunwale of a boat into 10-foot waves in the pitch black requires something far beyond tragic faith.
It does. The biblical text uses a very specific Greek word to describe Peter's state of mind, oligopistia, which translates to little faith.
Okay.
But we have to be incredibly careful how we define his doubt when he begins to sink. When the text says Peter doubted, the Greek word used is distazo.
And distazo doesn't mean outright skepticism, like suddenly deciding Jesus is a fraud.
No, distazo literally means vacillation. It means a double stance, wavering back and forth between 2 points. Peter's doubt was a deeply human vacillation between the commanding word of the Lord calling him forward and the undeniable, terrifying reality of the boisterous wind around him.
It's just a mixture of profound courage and totally understandable, crippling anxiety.
Exactly.
It is so relatable to anyone listening to this right now.
Yeah.
You step out in faith, you take the new job, you make the hard decision, you're doing the thing, and then suddenly you look around at the reality of your situation and go, wait, what am I doing? I'm walking on water in a hurricane. This defies physics. Of course he panicked.
Right. And that's exactly why the sources argue we shouldn't be so harsh on Peter. Doubt, that wavering, that double stance, is a fundamental part of the human condition.
There's a wonderful piece of history in the sources regarding Martin Luther that touches on this.
Oh, the great Protestant reformer? Yes.
Yeah, a young, deeply distraught pastor came into Luther's study, his head hanging low, and confessed his struggle. He said, I feel so ashamed. Sometimes I have profound trouble believing the very things I preach.
Which, for a professional clergy member, feels like a career-ending admission of failure.
Totally. When a seminary professor later asked his students how they would have counseled that young doubting man, they all sanctimoniously said he should leave the ministry immediately.
Naturally.
But what Martin Luther actually did is beautiful. He raised his head, gave the young man a massive smile, and said, thanks be to God, I thought I was the only one.
I love that, normalizing the struggle.
Right. Peter had little faith, but it was enough to propel him out of the safety of the boat. And perhaps more importantly, when his humanity caught up with him and he sank, his little faith was enough to make him cry out to the right person. He yells, Lord, save me.
And Jesus immediately reaches out and catches him. As a seasoned fisherman, Peter was likely a strong, heavy man. Yet the text implies Jesus holds him up effortlessly over the chaos.
But then a crucial detail occurs.
Yes. Jesus doesn't magically levitate them both to the distant shoreline. He walks Peter back and puts him back in the boat. He places him right back in that cramped, patched-up scrap wood vessel with the other 11 men.
So what does this all mean? Because the temptation for anyone hearing this story is to draw a direct, materialistic line and say, okay, if you just muster up enough unwavering faith, you won't sink in life. You can magically conquer all your physical problems, your crumbling finances, your chronic illness, your struggling career.
It's treated like a prosperity gospel thing.
Exactly. But the theological sources point out that interpreting the story that way misses the entire point of the event.
It really does. The boat itself is a massive, enduring metaphor. Since the earliest centuries of Christianity, the boat has been utilized as a symbol for the church or the community of believers.
It's even in the architecture, isn't it?
Yes. If you look at classical architecture, the central main gathering part of a cathedral is called the nave. That word derives directly from the Latin word navis, meaning ship.
The architecture itself is literally telling you that you are inside a ship.
The boat represents a safe haven in a chaotic, hostile world. It is the community of faith navigating the abyss together. When Peter begins to sink, Jesus doesn't isolate him. He picks him up and places him back into the community, back into the tension of human relationships inside the boat.
There was an exercise detailed in one of the sermons we reviewed that really brings the sensory reality of this home. It was called Ignatian contemplation, which is a type of imaginary prayer.
Right. The pastor recounted a man named Roger who was struggling to emotionally connect with this passage. A retreat leader challenged him to mentally place himself inside the narrative using all his senses.
And how did that go?
Well, the first time Roger tried, he imagined himself merely as a detached reporter, just watching the storm from a high cliff, completely uninvolved. The second time, he imagined himself as one of the rowers inside the boat.
Closer to the action.
Yeah, but in that scenario, he realized he was frantically focused entirely on saving his own skin, gripping his oar, barely even looking up at Jesus.
But the leader pushed him to go deeper, to imagine himself as Peter, actually stepping over the wet wood and walking out onto the raging sea.
And Roger found that visualization incredibly difficult. In his imagination, as he tried to walk toward Jesus, he wanted to look calmly at Christ's face, but the sensory overload was too much. The roaring wind, the freezing spray, he was too distracted by the terrifying waters surrounding him.
He felt himself starting to plunge under the surface.
Exactly. But as the dark water rose around him, he imagined a very large, rough hand reaching out and tightly grabbing his wrist.
The way he described the physical sensation of that grip is incredible. Roger said he could sense immense, terrifying power in the hand holding him, a power that could have easily crushed his own hand.
But instead of fear, the feeling radiating from that grip was one of absolute, unshakable safety. Once he felt that secure hold, he suddenly became completely oblivious to the chaos of the waves.
It's a profoundly powerful visualization of grace, and it leads to the ultimate grounding takeaway from all these texts. We are not actually called to walk on water.
No, as the commentator noted, if we tried to rely on our own strength or the purity of our faith to defy the physics of our problems, we would sink like rocks.
So leave the physics-defying water walking to the Creator.
Exactly. We aren't required to perform spectacular miracles to prove our worth. We are simply called to realize who is in the boat with us. We are called to recognize that the great I Am, the one who tramples the chaos monster, is present in the midst of our terrifying storms.
And crucially, our job as the people in the boat is not to judge the wavering faith of others, but to stretch out our own hands and pull flailing, sinking people out of the dark water and into the safety of that community.
That's the real miracle of the story.
Let's retrace the steps of this incredible historical and spiritual journey. We started with the sheer physical terror of exhausted, sleep-deprived men in a flat-bottomed scrap wood boat, getting battered by a violent vacuum storm in a 700-foot deep basin during the coldest part of the night.
And then we explored how their terror fractured their minds, rooted in an ancient worldview where the sea wasn't just water, but a chaotic, demonic abyss seeking to devour them.
We saw the human figure trample that chaos, declaring himself as the great I Am of the Exodus. And we dug into the deep psychological difference between the reactive, bartering, tragic faith of the men who stayed frozen in the boat and the wavering, vacillating, yet incredibly brave faith of Peter, who stepped out into the storm.
Ultimately discovering that the goal of the spiritual life isn't individual supernatural performance, but finding safety in the communal boat with the Lord of the storm and helping others find that same haven.
It is a totally different narrative than the one most of us grew up hearing. It's grounded in archaeology, weather patterns, ancient mythos, and deeply relatable human psychology.
It really is. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over something that builds on the reality of these tempests. We all instinctively pray for peace. We ask God to immediately calm the chaotic storms in our lives, to make the wind stop right this second.
Right, nobody wants the storm.
But consider the timeline of this narrative. If the disciples had experienced completely smooth sailing to the other side of the lake that night, they never would have been pushed to their breaking point.
They wouldn't have seen him walk on water.
They never would have discovered that the man sleeping in their boat was the Lord of the Abyss. So what if the current chaos in your own life isn't an obstacle keeping you from your destination? What if that blinding whiteout blizzard you are navigating right now is the exact necessary environment required to teach you who is actually sitting in the passenger seat with you?
That is a staggering perspective shift to carry with you today. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring your sources, keep asking the hard questions, and stay curious. We'll see you next time.